All right. Good morning, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us. Anna and I are holding this roundtable to discuss interview season this year. And the APDR board sent out a statement probably maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, outlining our wish that programs throughout the country abide by a virtual only interview season. And we saw in the APDR dashboard, or the what's it called, the email server, I should say, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of concern. I think one was a valid point. Was there enough discussion with the members throughout the country regarding this provision? And it was suggested that we have a roundtable to discuss it. And so Anna and I invited Darel Heitkamp to share some slides. He put out a survey last year. One of the points that we discussed in that email was the fact that we had a lot of feedback from both program directors as well as interviewees during the virtual season, that many were happy with the experience. And that is one of the reasons why we felt comfortable moving forward with a virtual only again this year. This was also before the Delta variant, which we are now experiencing throughout the country. And many institutions, including my own, have excluded the ability for us to even have on-site interviews. So my institution personally has stated that every department has to have virtual only. And I'm not sure if that's happening around the country as well, but I do know in Washington State, they've made it, we're a little bit more stringent here. So I'm going to start with having Darel start with the slides just to go over the experience with us.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody from the East Coast, where I'm at in Orlando. I just wanted to share with this roundtable discussion some of my thoughts. I've really, this has been an interest of mine. I've really paid attention to the virtual interviewing experience, starting last year when it was clear that's what was going to happen. Up until today, and this is just, an interest of mine, seeing how all of this unfolds. And so I definitely wanted the opportunity to share what I know and the results of a study that we are currently doing. So these, I'm going to share preliminary data. We just collected them. The survey study just happened weeks ago. And so we are still analyzing the data, and we intend on writing it up. Okay, okay, there we go. Okay, so I knew, a lot of us knew it was going to be a problem planning this coming year's interview season. The 21-22 interview season was going to be difficult in the sense that there wasn't much time to turn it around. Like, we weren't going to have time to look at data from last year. Okay, we weren't going to have any published data to go on. There wasn't enough time to do any studies, to look at the data, to publish those data, and to have those back in time to make decisions about the coming interview season. It just, there wasn't enough time because, really the official end of last interview season was match day in mid-March, and we really have to know what we're doing by July. So that's 3.5 months, and it's just not going to happen. So we really needed to know. We needed our APDR board to have a sense of what we were going to do without much data, and that's a tough spot for them. They needed to have updated information, and as we know, with variants, and it's a difficult decision to make. And what we do know was that virtual interviewing was not catastrophic, and many reports show that it improved many aspects of interviewing, like applicant equity, and wellness. And so many people are even questioning whether it's the future of GME interviewing. We don't know that, but what we do know is that it wasn't a terrible experience for most. So many people even suggested that we would have 2 years of virtual interviews because of this. And you know, it looks like for most specialties, that's what's happening. Pediatrics as a specialty did actually pull off a data-driven report. They had a great survey of their applicants and their program directors, and they've got it published online last week, lessons learned and future recommendations. And you can see the quote I have there. It's covered up for me. I can't really read it to you, but they see it as an opportunity to look at inequities in their process. And that's going to be true for every specialty and GME as a whole. There's obviously a lot of inequities, and this is going to be an opportunity for us to improve that and to try to fix those. So this is online now, you can look it up. But again, the turnaround in time made it difficult for us to be informed about the coming interview season with data. This specialty was able to pull that off, at least with one study. So the APDR, APDIR position statement came out June 28th. And I think it's you know, right on the money. Programs, you know, based on the match data showed that they did just as well in the match. Some programs did better. And so it did not certainly hurt programs. Radiology was very competitive. IR was very competitive. The applicants did well. And so the fact that we see anecdotally that there were improvements in certain areas like equity and wellness show us that it's at least reasonable to continue down this path, particularly as Ange said, with certain last minute issues like the Delta variant, you know, surging right now. It's as we know, I think a good idea that we issued this in terms of specialties. Radiology was in the middle of the pack. We were 6th. OBGYN was 1st. They pretty much declared it right away. They're very progressive. They have lots of excellent control measures for application overload, for over application. They've instituted great control measures this year. We can share those and talk about those sometime. Ophthalmology, peds, urology, psych were all ahead of radiology. Radiology was 6th in declaring or recommending virtual interviews. And some specialties haven't done this at the level of their society, but individual programs have declared that they are going to be virtual. And that has happened in emergency medicine and dermatology. And so we have individual programs. The current list right now is 10 program director societies have issued statements similar to APDR. And again, radiology was number 6. And in terms of overall numbers of interviews, you know, we're talking family medicine, internal medicine, general surgery, pediatrics. Those are, you know, probably the 4 largest specialties in terms of numbers of interviews. So most interviews this year are going to be virtual. And I would assume that more specialties are going to join this list. Emergency medicine programs, interestingly, are adding on one at a time. They haven't done it on a specialty basis, but most programs have signed on to this. And there's a few dermatology programs that have declared. So radiology is in the middle of this pack. I think it's totally appropriate. We weren't sort of the early adopters, but I think radiology made the right decision. Okay, so a bit about the research alliance that I'm in. I am in what's called the Radiology Residency Education Research Alliance. It's a newly formed group of radiology residency programs, and you can see the distribution of programs throughout the country. There's about 33 residencies, and we conduct generally survey-based radiology education research, and the participants are generally faculty, program directors, trainees, medical students, and we've really gone out of our way to achieve a balance among many factors. Program size is important, geographic distribution, university affiliation, rural urban divide. All of those things have been taken into account to select participating programs so that our data are good representative samples of the United States. So even though it's a smaller sample, it's not the entire country, it's pretty reliable. It's not biased, in other words. And you can see the breakdown of what you would call a non-university affiliated program in green versus a university affiliated program in red. So the project we did is looking at the virtual interview season from last year, and we decided to have two different pool of participants. We have applicants that we surveyed and program directors. So the applicants are applicants who matched to programs in our alliance. And then we also made a survey for program directors, and they were large surveys. They took a while, but because they're in our alliance, they are a captive audience, and they're willing to take the extra time to do our survey. The response rates were satisfactory. And in these surveys of the virtual interview season, we asked questions in these primary areas. We asked about the technology and issues, relating to the technology. We asked them to describe the season. We asked a lot about their attitudes toward virtual interviewing and about their attitudes about the effects or the downstream consequences of virtual interviewing. And then we also asked about how they feel about application control measures. So that would include application caps, it would include preference signaling, and a lot of dates, standardized dates for helping to control over application. We also asked some specific questions for each of those surveys. For applicants, we wanted to know about the money they spent on applying, the money they saved not traveling, the number of programs that they applied to and interviewed at, and whether they felt in the end that they over applied. They matched, knowing they matched and everything turned out fine. Do they really think they over applied? For program directors, whether they adjusted their number of interview slots to account for the virtual interview season, how they filled relative to prior years, and whether they think they over interviewed. Here's a quick rundown of some of the major points in the area of what I said, describing the interview season. And we set this up as a semantic differential evaluation. So they had to choose between opposite terms. So was it convenient or was it inconvenient? And they had to select on a rating scale of 1 to 7, 1 being it was completely inconvenient. That describes the interview season. And 7, it was convenient, and that completely describes the interview season. So they had to select on that scale, 4 being neutral, how they best see the interview season. And you can see that in general, the theme that really struck us was that that program directors and applicants all generally were positive on most of these descriptors. They felt it was easy, convenient, overall pleasant, economical. Certainly that was an obvious answer. Almost everybody said that gave a 6 or a 7 for economical. The applicants, they're millennials. They thought the technology was simple. Program directors, not quite so much. Improving applicant equity was an important point. We can see that both groups thought it achieved that. Improved radiology's contribution to climate action or climate change. They both agreed with that. And then the applicants were asked about, here's an interesting one, encouraged over interviewing. That was an important point. So they thought that this, virtual interviewing, yes, it does kind of lead to over interviewing. And then another interesting point was that they thought virtual interviewing encouraged interviewing out of their home region, kind of breaking that regional bias that we all talk about. It's just so much easier, cheaper, you don't have to worry about all the travel costs, that it encouraged that. So in general, there was a lot of positive agreement in a lot of these descriptors among both groups. When looking at the program directors' side of things, their survey and their attitudes toward the interview season, when we asked, I felt I was able to establish a personal connection with my applicants. I can't see, let me, hold on. Okay, there we go. Sorry,
I can read it to you, Darel, if you
can. No, I fixed it.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm back where I need to be. 54% agreed with that statement, 25% disagreed. So, virtual interviewing, didn't create a barrier for connection. I felt I was able to represent myself and our program positively during virtual interviews. 64% agreed with that statement. Despite the inability to visit in person, I was able to get a feel for a candidate's character and goals. This is an important statement. This is, I think, a question we need to ask, because a lot of people think we need to meet in person to understand and get a real sense of a person. But 68% agreed that, despite not being able to visit in person, we still were able to glean these important points. I felt uncomfortable creating our rank list, not having met the candidates in person. 66% disagreed. So this is a negatively stated statement here. And so 66% disagreed with this statement. They did not feel uncomfortable creating the rank list despite being virtual. Here's another statement. Overall, the benefits of the virtual interview season outweighed the drawbacks. So this is a real general overall statement. 60% agreed that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, program directors. On the applicant side, there's a couple important questions we asked. The virtual interview format enabled me to better care for myself and my family throughout the interview season. So this is a really vital question we asked, and we asked the applicants, and the answer was 90% agreed, either agreed or strongly agreed to this statement, and 0% disagreed or strongly disagreed. So this was an important question. And another important question we asked the applicants, the virtual interview season improved applicant equity by reducing costs and improving accessibility to applicants with disabilities and caregiving responsibilities. And again, we had a substantial number who agreed or strongly agreed to that statement. So again, we're just going through this data. We haven't even done the regression analysis to see if there's any strong correlation among different subgroups, but the overall themes that are jumping out at the raw data are that there are many common overall positive experiences that we see for both groups. And we see that it tends to improve applicant wellness, applicant equity, and the opportunity for radiology to contribute to climate action. And so those are really big themes. And we see that these themes are also being expressed by other specialties, and we're starting to see it in the literature. So here's just a couple articles that are now available online. One's in academic medicine, one's in medical teacher. The top one is from Stanford. It's actually a letter to the editor. The bottom one is a Canadian group that wrote it, and they're talking about the carbon footprint and radiology's GME's contribution to climate action. And so this issue is going to resonate, and it's going to get traction. And so certainly there are a lot of issues. There's a lot of reasons as a program director that you want to meet your applicants in person, and I understand that. I was a program director for many years, but we probably should wait to see what the data shows and what other kind of issues are at play here, because it's going to be multifactorial, certainly. So those were the preliminary results of our data.
Thank you, Darel. That was fantastic. We really appreciate your data and explaining to that. And so Anna and I wanted to open it up for conversation, and I know to ask anybody if they're still thinking of pursuing in-person interviews, or if they would just like to ask some general questions to the group.
Or, for example, express disagreement with what we just heard. Your opinion is extremely important to us. Yeah. We deeply respect it, and we wanted to have everyone to have an opportunity to voice it.
Hi, everybody. This is Neil Madan. I sent out an email, so I'm sure everyone's heard my opinion. I'll tell you that my thought process is changing right now. I will say I have a lot of concerns about the surveys. I filled out several of them, and I understand the balancing need. I would say that in terms of talking about equity and fairness, and also the applicant experience, I mean, honestly, I think I can get a good sense of the applicants very easily from the interview. So when I hear about how program directors are gauging the interview, virtual interviews, I actually have no concerns about doing virtual interviews. My main concern is actually applicants in terms of how they choose programs and how they assess programs. And what I don't see really affected in these surveys, I mean, yeah, if we look statistically, people are doing well in terms of the match. But what I see is that people are making choices on their rank lists that are very different now than they were when they went to in-person interviews. And programs that they're going potentially by hearsay, by what other people have said about the program. And your impression of a program can be very different. And so, I went to Mount Auburn for my residency. I had a lovely experience. I don't know that I would have ended up there if I hadn't actually interviewed there and really seen what that small community program is like. And when we talk about equity, bigger programs that have more money and can spend more money on videos and can give a better virtual experience, there's equity effects in terms of how programs are being assessed. I'm a smaller program. We don't have as much money as maybe some of the bigger programs. So there are equity effects on the program that I think are important to think about. And I mean, last year I spent my entire interview season budget developing video and content, and that might have been a much more smaller fraction compared to the food costs, say, of a bigger program. Because that video cost is a fixed cost. And so hopefully maybe that cost will be smaller for me. But when we talk about equity, I think the challenge is that the surveys don't really assess some of these data points. Similarly, I don't think the surveys are really getting a sense of, are applicants making different choices than if they actually had gone in person? So yes, they're doing well, they're matching well. But the question is that actually the ideal program for them? And would they have ended up at a better program had they gone through the interview process? I fully am supportive of some of the issues of climate change and thinking about that climate action. But at the same time, I mean, this is a big decision for many of our students. And it is a big deal for them to move across the country. And finally, the piece about looking at, trying to get it beyond the geographic burden or the geographic favoritism. I will tell you, in looking at my rank list and where people ended up, I interviewed much more diversely, and I lost people to programs I would never have lost in the past. So even if they interviewed with me, they didn't end up leaving their geographic restrictions. I mean, that's a personal preference that people have. And I know Harp's on this call. Harp and I have talked a long time about this. At one point, he was trying to get, because he was a program director before me, at one point he was trying to recruit people from more of a geographic diversity. And we've even tried that in the past, but people want to end up where they want to end up. And so, I think it's yeah, they're going to think about looking at other programs, but really what that geographic boundary, there are still geographic boundary restrictions, and that's not imposed by us. That's just personal preference. And so we're trying to get beyond that in terms of our interview selection process by trying to find people who are more likely to end up at our program. So I respectfully, understand the survey results, but I think that deep dive, really, that's where you start to see breakdowns. I will tell you that I have been moving, partly because of the Delta variant, moving away from potentially doing an in-person interview, but I'm probably going to be offering second looks, and I don't think we've had any discussion about second looks and what programs are going to be doing, but I'm kind of leaning towards that just because I know that there are medical schools also that are going to prevent their students from interviewing in person, but do want to give the opportunity for people who want to come in person to be able to see the program and really get a sense of, could this be a home they could see themselves in for 4 years? So those are my thoughts.
May I just,
Yeah.
First of all, I wish that we didn't have, I'm moving away from interviews because of the Delta variant, but we do, right? And so let us hope that this discussion is not going to be entirely, pointless in a few weeks. One thing I know, for example, in my institution, we, just like Angelisa's, we will not be able to offer anything, whether we wanted it or not, because of the concerns of the variants. As far as, Neil, I just wanted to point out that, yes, smaller programs might, on occasion, benefit from a direct look. However, many programs actually, what I'm trying to say is that we don't really know how people choose and what, except for anecdotal experiences. My own is that I went to a much smaller program because, for example, the Boston programs, when I interviewed there in a bunch, my car was towed by overzealous police. And that, no, seriously, I parked in the proper place and, it was like Christmas towing, they need to make a buck. And I just didn't rank Boston. Okay, when I was a program director at Columbia, I knew that my interviewees during a snowstorm, because of the terrible experience of getting to New York City and then navigating to New York City in the storm, the expense, likely not going to rank us. So, anecdotally, whatever happens to you during the interview affects you. But it does not necessarily mean that the experience is going to be particularly pleasant, and it may not be related to you, and what you do. So it's something to think about.
I also wanted to point out, Darel, I think Neil's point is really a great one, that possible future research, since many of us will be doing virtual again this year, is to maybe dive down a little bit deeper in how applicants choose programs. If that virtual experience, maybe asking questions like, did you feel less inclined to rank a program highly in a town that you've never visited? Or, maybe I think that's a real good point. And the reason why I think it's important is I'm not confident that we're going to go back next year to completely in-person interviews. I think many societies are starting to talk about possibly a hybrid approach. And to your point, Darel, I think program directors would be really more comfortable having data to start making choices about the future once the coronavirus is not much of a factor. But Neil, I wanted to thank you. I think that's something I hadn't thought of, and I think it's really important.
I think to echo your statement, though, we can even take it a step beyond, which is to say, is there actually factors of equity in terms of people who've traveled more robustly versus those who haven't, that actually leads them to feel more comfortable going further away? So, I mean, in fact, this idea of trying to be equitable, I mean, there are students who are going to actually have had less of an experience, less opportunities to travel, less opportunities to visit other programs, and that also then will have an effect potentially on how they see programs. And so, you know, the opportunity to travel actually could potentially be an advantage to people who are not necessarily of as significant means. And then furthermore, we're trying to address this at a program level, but really we have to understand that the entire GME operation in terms of interview season from ERAS to NRMP is broken. We're trying to solve this broken problem by kind of creating our own solution that works in our own program, just like every other program. But the challenge we have is, you know, why don't we ask the question, these medical schools, you know, could they actually support their residents and provide financial aid to them to allow them to travel? Can we limit the number of interviews that then allows for a more meaningful interview experience? You know, to what extent would programs be willing to help support residents to come, or students and applicants to visit their programs? And so as we move away from potentially the virtual/hybrid interview season and kind of go beyond to the post-COVID world, I think we've got to be very careful about not trying to solve all the problems within our own societies in terms of how we treat this as program directors, understanding that the problem actually comes at multiple fold and really needs to be solved more holistically.
Yeah. Does anybody else? Thank you, Neil. I really appreciate it. Does anybody else have any thoughts or want to say something to the group?
My hand up, but it's...
Oh, sorry, Richard. Yes, you're right.
So a bunch of thoughts. So the first is, and this has been kind of alluded to, we have two issues right now. One is COVID. One is what is the best and fairest way to interview medical students? And we need to disaggregate those two. So are we going to interview virtually this interview season? Probably because of COVID. And I'm calling you from COVID Central, which is Central Florida. So we've had to re-engineer a tremendous amount of our activities just in general now because of the crisis that we're having, which is interestingly relatively geographic in nature if you look at vaccination rates and COVID positivity and so on. So let's just say that the odds are that our interviews are going to be virtual this year because of a health crisis. And think of it that way. And then the separate issue is, how should interviews be conducted? So I can tell you that from my own personal experience, and this is my own personal experience as a former program director for many, many years, as a chief of department for many, many years, there's no comparison to me between holding a meeting in person and holding a meeting over a computer. You can't get the sense of body language, of tone, of intonation, of everything that goes into either holding a meeting with a large group of people or holding a meeting one-on-one. And again, I'm just speaking from a personal sense. So that if half of your presentation is comedy, which is usually the case with me, trying to do comedy over a computer is like trying to do comedy in a cemetery. Then no one's heckling you, but the audience reaction really stinks. So I am a fan of doing things in person in general, just because I think it's a better way to do it. The question then becomes an issue of our organization and how it advocates. So there's an analogy to me in terms of what our organization, as a larger part of the relationship with the AUR did years ago with the California list of states that it would not reimburse state employees to go to. We subscribe to that both in the AUR and then secondarily the APDR, because we hold our meetings at the same time. And we held a principled, or the organizational leadership, which I wasn't part of, held a very principled point of view that this is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, we were the only ones pretty much who did it. And it really disadvantaged a lot of people. And so the policy was abandoned. However, in the adoption of the policy, the membership was not polled in terms of how they felt about it. And when there was a meeting that was held at the AUR, there were a lot of people who were very uncomfortable with speaking their minds. And because, and I'll use this phrase, and it's a very loaded phrase, so take it as it is, they felt that there was virtue signaling, that they were being told that this was the virtuous thing to do, and to oppose it would mark you as an unvirtuous person or even politically retrograde.
Mhm.
I do fear in a way that that message is coming across with the APDR right now, whether I agree or disagree with it. I think we have to be cautious as an organization to take the pulse of us. And I know that there's two conflicting impulses. On the one hand, you want to lead by example, and you want to say that regardless, I know that this is the right thing to do, but you also don't want to be out of step with what your organization necessarily feels, and you don't want to alienate them.
Definitely.
So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think the APDR was coming from, quite honestly, we didn't talk much about equity. It was more about safety. It was a feeling, and to me, that didn't feel virtuous. It was just what is best for our candidates and what's best for our faculty. I think many of my faculty were uncomfortable having 150 people flying in.
I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I said at the beginning that we have to disaggregate those two issues.
Yeah.
Because the APDR statement was not solely about safety. It was also about equity. So it's not just a safety issue. It's also, we feel that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. That's great feedback. I will say for the person that drafted that, my main concern was safety, but also I thought it was, and the benefit can be equity. But to your point, Richard, that can be, I really like the virtuous thought, and I appreciate that. And we'll be more sensitive to that in the future. I mean, I just think that's a really great way of stating it.
However, the equity concerns are real. And while I agree with Angelisa that safety is paramount, the fact that, it's just so much less expensive for the students. It's, $10,000 here, $10,000 there, even more, and all of a sudden it's real money. And then how many, trips, just, how many flights did we save? That's tens of thousands of flights. And that's, in the days and, the West Coast is burning is kind of important consideration. I'm not sure how much we are holier than thou here. We, you can also make a point that when you are in Florida advocating for vaccinations, you are also, politically not considering the feelings of 50% of your population who are resisting it. But
yeah, I think the question is going to be next year when their safety is not, possibly, it might be another year after this, who knows if we get another variant. But I think to everyone's point, it will be a very interesting conversation when we take safety out of the equation and talking as a society of how we will hold interviews coming up. I know that I'm very interested in hybrid because I like being able to offer virtual for those that might not have considered it. And I've talked to other program directors that have felt the same.
I'm curious about the concept of hybrid interviewing, because we actually, before COVID got as bad as it is now, because we're going to be all virtual. But do you feel that there could be, you introduce bias in hybrid interviewing? Because will the faculty think, consciously or subconsciously, that those who went to the effort to come to see the program are more interested. I mean, Anna, I know this has been a passion of hers for a long time, the concept of signaling.
Mhm.
That is there a way, and I know that some societies have adopted a way for interviewees to say, this is really where I want to go. It's like early decision or early action kind of.
Yeah. So to your point, Richard, wouldn't it be nice to have both, say early signaling and I'm really interested, but I choose not to fly? Right. So you signal that, okay, I'm only limiting my the programs that I apply to 20, and I'm really serious about you, but because of money or because of breastfeeding or because of family obligations, at this time, it's just easier for me to virtual. I think it would be great.
I think that would be ideal.
Yeah.
I agree with you. And I know Anna does, because she's been advocating for this for a long time.
Yeah. So I think that signaling is something that we should be talking as a society for sure.
And are we?
Karen Johnson, I just wanted to read, the applicants who are surveyed only had a virtual. They do not know how an in-person experience would have changed their impression of the program. So the results, while interesting, are hard to interpret. We plan to do virtual this year, but would like to offer in-person experience as well. Discussion about this would be helpful, especially in light of trying to maintain equity. So interesting, yeah. So we just kind of segued into that, Karen, even before I read your chat. So Karen, can you come on? Are you thinking you're going to do? So what you're describing, Karen, is hybrid.
Right. Yeah. So I would love to hear what some people are thinking in terms of that, because
is your university allowing?
As of now, but that could change at any minute because of the Delta variant. Things are changing rapidly. You know, there's a lot of talk at our institute. So our institution is committed to virtual interviews, but the program directors at my institution are trying to consider in-person experiences as well, some sort of receptions or something like that for those who may want to come visit the area. You know, it's difficult, right? Because that to some degree, in my mind, abolishes the equity component of the virtual interview, because there will still be, you know, people who can then come fly to visit your institution, you know, are obviously those who can afford to do that. So I would just love to hear what people are thinking when they talk about doing a hybrid sort of approach to the interview season.
Yeah.
Especially again in terms of trying to maintain the equity that virtual interviews, you know, provide to us.
All right. When I meant hybrid, I meant next year. I know University of Washington, we can't do hybrid. I was talking to be very clear about the future. Vic, I'm going to let Vicky, Neil, Vicky has her hand up, and then I'll go to you.
I think Neil's hand was up before mine. If that, or I can. But my
Please
only
go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I think an interesting hybrid model would be, I think it's done in internal medicine, or one of the big programs at University of Arizona, I think they've done for a while, is where all the formal interviews are virtual, but then there are a bunch of scheduled you know, tours and visits that people can sign up for, completely separate from the actual formal interview, so that the timing is more flexible and the separation of informal and formal is very defined. And I think that might be a good hybrid model to kind of look towards. They have a nice presentation on, I think it's on YouTube, that it's a big long presentation. It shows how they've constructed it, but I think that might be a way to also incorporate some degree of signaling, because people are going to go visit the places they're potentially interested in, you know. But I would keep the two things separate, and maybe have the interview be first, the formal interview, and then the informal aspect come later. But that's just my thought.
The problem with signaling by showing up is the problem of equity. We need to have signaling that have nothing to do with actually showing up, so that people who, you know, either have small children or don't have the money to travel are not, they should not be combined. But the virtual interview or visit, I mean, at some point we'll have to allow visits.
Neil, did you have something to say? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, so I was going to actually say two things. Number one, so we're going through the whole discussion right now about signaling and how do we look at and treat, especially second looks fairly. I think there's two issues to it, right? One is you want to be careful about not just giving somebody a higher priority just because they showed up. But at the same time, I don't know about the rest of you, but like when somebody sends me an email saying that, where they're going to rank me number one, it doesn't make me say, oh, I'm going to put them at the number one part of my rank list, but it does make me look at their application again. And I certainly have had times where, I look at it at the end of the rank list season, I say, oh, I probably treated this person not as fairly as I should have. Maybe I'm going to increase it, put them a little bit higher on my rank list. I think that, talking about kind of the virtual interview season and also just interviews in general, I mean, there's some people who just don't interview well, right? And so, but when we actually see how they're like, in the reading room or just kind of talking to them, they actually, their medical knowledge, their interest shines in a way that it doesn't in interviews. So, when we talk about equity, we also have to think about like just personalities and who actually interviews well. Just because they interview well doesn't mean that they're actually going to be the best resident. And so, the whole day experience is sometimes very valuable in terms of getting to know somebody and actually thinking about how you want to look at them on your rank list. So there are more than one aspect of equity, which is not just, it also, we have to think about how we're being equitable to different personality types, how people interview. Are we really being fair to people? I mean, I think in radiology, in some ways it's hard to actually judge an applicant because there's so little in med school that necessarily translates to radiology. So there are certain factors we look at, I think, in a lot of our interviews. But in any case, the discussion we're having is how do we make sure that we also allow ourselves to see people who do well in those second looks and might actually bump them up. Same time, there are going to be some people who, they come across well in an interview, but they can't hold it together when they come and visit you and like sit in the reading room and you're like, no, thanks. I don't want this person in my program. So I think, second looks may both help and hurt. And it's not necessarily just going to be a signaling mechanism for how they do. And then, I guess going back to one of the other issues, is it possible at this point? I know it's late, it's August now. Is there a way for us to actually implement some kind of signaling mechanism this season? Because boy, for people to be able to indicate that they have who their top 10 programs are would just make, I think, all of our lives easier, and is really what's going to allow us to actually get a sense as we kind of get more data to figure out how signaling mechanisms work that might actually inform us in terms of future years. And do we want to stay with the virtual season or do we want to move towards a hybrid model? I think that could actually have a huge value to us.
Yeah.
And I know ENT is doing it, but it would be so tremendous if we could get something implemented in radiology.
I just wanted to thank you for making these two enormously important points, and both of them scientifically valid. Our interviews have never been shown to actually allow us to choose the best resident. And so there is a major question whether our interviews do anything, but in fact bias us against those who are not like us. Thank you for making the point. You're absolutely right, and all the data support you. And number two is, I think Angelisa has pointed out that we're going to make this a priority, particularly for the next season, to make signaling sort of, make it or break it, because this year, you are going to have the USMLE 1, the much maligned score. Next year, you won't have it. And so the next year is going to be even more important. Angelisa, I think I'm speaking for everybody.
Yeah, and I think we have to get buy-in. So there was a little commotion with us just coming out with this recommendation. If you can imagine, Neil, if we came out with, we're going to be doing signaling now, I don't think it would be appropriate for the board to unilaterally so Anna is the president next year and is the program chair for AUR. And I'm confident that that the board will discuss steps that are needed in order to get buy-in and to start that trial. Wouldn't you
I'm
agree?
gonna actually add a third point to then, just so that Anna, you can think about it for next year, which is, you know, we talk about losing step one. You know, who's going to get hurt most by step one is our foreign medical graduates. And we can talk about equity all we want, but in fact, there's a huge stigma and bias against foreign grads, who are actually sometimes some of the best residents I've had. And so if we're going to talk about equity, we also need to talk about how we're going to actually make it a fair mechanism. And I'm going to tell you, everybody, you know, my issue is
one of the reasons why we're losing USMLE step one. I will never say anything quite so controversial again. I dig it. We completely understand, and we'll be working on signaling.
Yeah. Darel, we have 10 minutes left, so I want to try to get to Darel and Judah, who hasn't spoken either.
In terms of the signaling, their signaling is happening right now. There's about, I just actually put the link on the chat of the website that ENT has posted their preliminary data. They have a paper that's currently in review about their last year experience. So they were the first specialty to use signaling. They used 5 signals per applicant. Obviously, they have a pretty small specialty, but it was very successful by their metrics, and they have a lot of interesting data to share. It was homegrown. They did it by hand. They matched up all the signals by hand, which is kind of tricky and risky. But the big news is that Eris has created a signaling feature within their software. It's a beta version, and they are going to test it with about 5 or 6 specialties this year. And you needed to express interest to get into that. I think there's like 6 programs that are testing it this year. So hopefully if we can like create a task force to study it, to get sort of everybody used to the idea, to educate everybody about what it is, the fact that programs will not be disadvantaged by it, to figure out how many signals an applicant should have. It should be a very small number, like 2 or 3, because the more signals you have, the less effective. And not getting a signal becomes a signal. You know, you want just a few signals, like 2 per applicant. Then maybe when it becomes available, you know, we can get in on it. But signaling will be one of the control measures to help with this over application. Signaling, and then of course application caps. So signaling is definitely happening, and there's going to be many more programs this year on board with that.
Judah, hi, welcome.
Hi. So, you know, my comment on the signaling discussion really turns around how much and when do you signal? You know, it's easy to signal at the end when the programs have already expended the effort to interview and choose who to interview. But I feel, at least from my own thoughts of going through, you know, this process now for many years, having a signal early on is more valuable for me. And there's, you know, an equity question in capping the number of applications that residents can send out. But I just feel that programs have been spending an inordinate amount of effort interviewing people who are not legitimately interested in them. And if you signal towards the end, it may help you rank, but it doesn't really help you identify the candidates in the middle of your core application group who are being left behind, who would be otherwise fantastic applicants.
May I ask
So my
you-
personal opinion is
may I
that
ask
signaling
you a
has to come earlier.
Mhm.
May I answer your question? Signaling doesn't work at the end. It doesn't matter. You know, in the match, the algorithm is going to give you, will match you to the sort of highest, your highest choice, if the medical student agrees with it, no matter what they're signaling. Signaling only works pre-match. In the pre-interview season, this is when signaling is instituted. It's not later on. It is, you know, the signaling in ERAS happens at the beginning, at the opening, and that's what they're beta testing.
That's right.
Because ERAS has nothing to do, it's not the NRMP, it's not the match. Ranking is in the NRMP. ERAS does pre-match, the interview season. This is where, you know, costs are incurred by the programs and by the medical students. And this is where we're signaling. It's gonna be only early.
Karen, I was just processing Vicky's comment, and if you are thinking of doing a hybrid model, Would it be possible for programs that are thinking of having people come on site just to visit, maybe instruct all of your interviewers, your faculty, that the ranking is done on that the equity is everybody has a virtual interview and the rank list is made from those virtual interviews, but anybody is welcome to visit campus, and therefore it benefits the applicants to be on site to just see your program. And so maybe that would be the equity, is that everyone is judged equally on virtual, and your score is not affected unless something happens on site, right? Like if something, being very reasonable, that if something was egregious, then that would affect the score, but that maybe your rank list was made from the virtual. I'm just trying to process that, because I think that's—
I was thinking even
concept.
If there was a way to, well, there would be a way to have the folks that come on site be unknown to the interviewers, right?
Yeah.
Only the residents essentially host, because that's one of the big benefits, right? Is they meet your residents.
Yes.
And so that's another thing I was thinking about, is just having it only the residents ever know who actually comes on site, and the interviewers or the people involved in making the rank list don't even know that.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think it is. I think keeping it blinded, Karen, would be good. And that might be something that maybe we do in the future as a hybrid model that is recommended, is that we continue to have virtual, have it blinded, and then those that are that really feel like they need to be on site to make a decision. But rather than calling it a second interview, that it's just a
tour.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, realize that bigger programs are going to be different than smaller programs. So bigger programs have more residents who may not have participated in the interview program, whereas more of the residents have participated in the interview program in smaller programs. I think applicants do want to meet faculty. And again, if you have a bigger program with lots of faculty, it's easier to isolate the people who interviewed. When you have a smaller program, again, it's harder. So, the size issue does affect that. And then if we think about equity, how a program shines is going to be different for a big program from a smaller program. And finally, I think you also have to remember that some applicants will actually shine in the second look. So are you disadvantaging them by trying to blind them? It's a difficult balance. I completely agree with you, and I've been looking at trying to keep it blind, but I also have to think about what is the downside of that as well.
Any other thoughts in our closing minutes? I really appreciate everyone's time.
Real quickly,
I think there's some interesting research coming up.
There's a lot of thoughts that surround this whole issue of second looks and campus tours and department visits out of the pediatric specialty, and they're very, very sensitive about equity. That's just like,
that is there.
And a couple ideas that they have, one of them they really have spent a lot of time talking about, is somehow disengaging or disassociating when rank lists are due for applicants and programs. And by that, I mean, they want to make programs submit their rank lists substantially earlier than applicants somehow, such that program rank lists will be due, and then a substantial number of weeks, like 3 or 4 weeks, where applicants could then visit programs and visit the departments, knowing that their presence and their visit will not influence their rank list because they've already been submitted. So that's being talked about a lot. And then also getting a tour of the campus, of the medical center, of the department by people not directly associated with the department. So whether it's a GME office or some kind of a organization that's set up to give campus tours or department tours, such that it's like you guys were talking about, more or less blinded to the interview committee of the department, so that there's no information that they've even visited. So obviously it's not going to be the same experience, but their point is that the visit is a signal, it's like writing a thank you note. It's like writing a love letter, essentially saying, I went out of my way and spent, $1,200 to visit your, that's a signal. And it kind of is. So they are really looking at this issue and trying to figure out a way to make it completely blinded and equitable.
Very good, which is great. So I think we had some great ideas. Our next roundtable, everyone, will be, it was proposed again by the APDR listserv, the concern by many program directors about the amount of time for board studying, the pressure that PDs are under prior to boards to give time off, as well as how to integrate basically case conference, having residents taking oral type cases again. I think there's a concern from many that our graduates are graduating without a skill set based upon the fact that we lost the oral boards. So that was proposed by Tara and Petra Lewis, and we'll be holding that in August. So look for your email to talk about those conversations. We are willing to we are excited to host these roundtables. If anybody has any other subjects that they would like to have a roundtable discussion, please forward them to myself and to Anna, and we will set that up. I think this was a great conversation. I really appreciate the honesty, and I really hope that everyone has a wonderful interview season, and that we'll have more discussions at AUR and possibly see each other at RSNA. We'll have another roundtable, our usual roundtable on Tuesday afternoon at RSNA, and we'll be kind of in the thick of it there, and we can start to hear from programs on how they're handling this year. So good luck, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Angelisa. Thank you, everybody. We just greatly appreciate your opinions, and a lot of good research is going to come out of this.
Yeah.
Thank you all.